There is no room for doubt on the Arab position. Trump's plan to displace Palestinians out of Gaza to make way for a US-controlled reconstruction project was explicitly rejected by Gulf states as well as Jordan and Egypt. Within 2 weeks of President Trump's outrageous comments about taking over Gaza and turning it into a Riviera, Egypt released a counter-proposal for rebuilding the war-torn Strip. The most glaring difference in Egypt's plan is that Palestinians will not be coerced to leave their homeland. The other difference is the timeline, which forecasts a 5-year roadmap rather than the 10 to 15 years suggested by the US. Ever since Israel's war in Gaza escalated and the extent of destruction drastically deteriorated, the conversation about what will happen the day after became a contentious issue. Who would rebuild? Who would govern? Will Hamas be involved? Will the Palestinian Authority take over? Will Israel take over? What role will Arab states play? And what responsibility does the international community carry in reconstruction efforts? Many of these questions remain unanswered, of course, but since the first phase of the long-awaited ceasefire came into effect in January, these conversations have taken center stage, starting with the most pressing issue of reconstruction, as a massive percentage of Gaza's population, 90%, remains internally displaced. The key details of Egypt's proposal were revealed to the National ahead of the anticipated emergency summit on Gaza in Riyadh. It includes the creation of an independent Palestinian agency without Hamas or the PA that would oversee the process. A similar committee had been proposed by Egypt in the past but was rejected by the PA because it would have undermined their legitimacy as a governing body. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we analyze the Egypt-led Arab proposal for Gaza and what it means for Palestinians, the region, and Middle East relations with the US. Just this week, President Sheikh Mohammed told US Secretary of State Marco Rubio during talks in Abu Dhabi that the UAE strongly opposes any attempt to displace the Palestinian people from Gaza. When President Trump revealed his ambitions for Gaza, Saudi Arabia immediately issued a public statement rejecting his plan. Other Arab states also echoed the sentiment. Egypt and Jordan both took a firm stance against Trump's suggestion that Palestinians would be forced to relocate into their countries. But what exactly does the Arab counter-proposal entail, and how feasible will it be to execute? We spoke about this with analysts from the Washington Institute. Senior fellow Ghaith Al-Omari says that as a starting point, the Egyptian proposal is focusing on the urgent need to rebuild in Gaza, albeit a little too ambitiously.
I am not a real estate expert, but I think by all accounts that I have seen, 3 to 5 years is just unrealistic. At the end of the day, the amount of destruction that you see in Gaza, and it's not only the physical destruction, it is the unexploded ordnance that you find there, the unexploded bombs, it is the actual basic infrastructure, etc. 3 to 5 years is maybe a bit too ambitious. Egypt is saying 3 to 5 years because this is what's in the ceasefire agreement. So the Egyptians want to stick to these timelines, but in reality, we know that it's going to take much, much longer than this.
Regardless of the timeline, the plan is to ensure that Palestinians will not be forcibly moved out of Gaza. Safe zones would be created during gradual reconstruction phases, while temporary shelters and accommodations would be set up to allow people to stay within the Strip at the same time. But with conditions there still very dire, they may have very little choice in the long run.
Gaza has been hell for many years. And it's been, a deeper hell since October 7th, but it's been hell for many years. And if you look at actually polling in previous, even before the war, many Gazans wanted to leave. So the idea of immigration has always been there from economic reasons. And you have to expect that people will continue to want to leave. Ironically, the Trump proposal has actually probably in that regard has backfired. Because in the past, actually, if you're a Gazan and you manage to get a visa somewhere to Europe, your whole neighborhood's going to come and congratulate you. Today, many people who would have left will think twice because they don't want to be seen as being complicit in, a second Nakba. But at the end of the day, people respond to concrete, practical aspects of their lives, and it will be unrealistic to expect that no one would want to leave.
What about the actual implementation of the reconstruction process? Egypt is proposing that an independent agency decreed by the Palestinian Authority, but without its participation, would oversee the efforts. But what would this body actually look like, and why does the PA seem to be sidelined in this process?
I suspect in this one that ambiguity is intentional at this stage, because these are very difficult questions. On the one hand, the question of the PA is easier, because at this stage, what is required from the PA is just to bless this effort, to basically say, we want this effort. Yes, the committee itself will be independent, may have maybe some PA representation, but it will be independent. But the Arab countries want this committee to be established through a decision by the PA. And the reason for this is that the Arab countries consider the Palestinian Authority to be the legitimate address for Palestinians. And as one Arab official said to me, if we want to come into Gaza, to play a role in Gaza, we have to do it on someone's authority. And the Arab countries will not do it on the authority of Israel because Israel is the occupying country. It'd be nice to do it on a Security Council resolution authority. However, good luck getting the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans to agree on anything these days. So the Palestinian Authority has to do the invitation. Now, I suspect some of the Arab countries will say to the PA, you invite us, but right now, until you get your act together, you're not going to be playing an active role. But that should be easy. What is more difficult is what to do with Hamas. Because Hamas wants to say that we are part of forming this committee because they want to basically create legitimacy for themselves. However, if Hamas is signing on this, then the Americans and the Israelis will say no. The Americans and Israelis are worried from what we call here the Hezbollah model, where Hamas is not part of this structure, but Hamas actually has the real power behind the structure. So at this moment, the Arab countries until now have kept this vague. But now, because of the very strong pressure coming from the United States, they might have to make a decision, and that might be the most difficult decision to be made when the Arab leaders meet.
Trump chose bold words when he said that the US would take ownership of Gaza. But Raith says there's more to read between the lines.
First of all, just to say with President Trump, you have to take him seriously, but not literally. When he says, I'm going to take over Gaza, this is not like a product of some interagency deliberation that created the position. This is something that he just said. Interestingly, it's facing a lot of pushback in the United States, including from Republicans. But really, the main question is exactly what do you do with this? No one wants Israel to stay. The Arab countries don't want Israel to stay. At the same time, the Palestinian Authority simply just does not have the capacity or, frankly, the credibility to immediately take over. So I think one area that will be deliberated by Arab leaders, and so far there is no consensus, is can you create a transitional arrangement from now to the reunification of Gaza and the West Bank? There was an Egyptian old proposal that talked about creating a social solidarity committee or something of this sort. The problem with the Egyptian proposal is that it is based on consensus between Hamas and Fatah. Yes, to create a technical or technocratic government, but it's based on consensus with Hamas, and any role for Hamas, even that kind of, secondary role, will be one that is unaccepted by the Israelis and most likely the Americans. And at the same time, Hamas is not going to cede and say, okay, we're leaving. So this is, I think, the crux of the matter. This is where it's going to be the most complicated, immediate question.
The question is, how can the Arab states and the US find common ground for any plan to actually work in Gaza?
The proposal as it stands now will be heavy on the actual reconstruction. What it takes to build, how much money, how much resources, etc. That, I think, will be a good foundation for a discussion with administration. What is going to be more complicated, and I think this is where things will start seeing maybe potential tension with the United States, is on basically three issues. One issue is what to do with Hamas. The American position, the Israeli position is very, very clear. No place for Hamas, not direct or indirect, in terms of governing Gaza the day after. That's one. Two, in terms of security, the US will be pushing Arab countries to put their own troops on the ground. This is extremely difficult, complicated, politically toxic. So that's going to be the second area. And the third area would be what to do with the Palestinian Authority. Arab states are saying the Palestinian Authority needs to be one that's ultimately in charge of Gaza. Israel, at least, is saying no PA, no Hamas. And in this sense, can the Arab propose a plan to rehabilitate, reform, build the capacity of the Palestinian Authority? But these are the 3 points that could be points of contention between the Arab countries and the Trump administration. If you want to talk about compromise, the big compromise is going to be, are Arab countries willing to send troops into Gaza? This is something that no Arab country wants to do because, frankly, for the same reason that the US doesn't want to send troops elsewhere. You don't want to send your citizens to go and be killed and kill. So Arabs will be very hesitant and resistant to this. There will be a lot of pressure, though, from the US for that. And if there's going to be a compromise, it's going to be, in my sense, in my estimation, it's going to be on the issue of, is there going to be Arab boots on the ground?
This is all happening at a time when the first phase of the Gaza ceasefire is approaching its end. everyone is bracing themselves as the second phase appears to be on thin ice. So what would happen if the Egyptian or other Arab proposals rub President Trump the wrong way?
Even if Trump is happy with the Arab proposal, there's a real risk of not going to phase two in Gaza. In Israel, Netanyahu is trying to balance two different considerations. One is an Israeli public that overwhelmingly wants to go to phase two, but a cabinet and a coalition that wants to restart the war. And so far, frankly, Netanyahu has always prioritized his coalition over his public opinion. But if you look at Hamas as well, Hamas wanted to move to phase two. It had conditions. The conditions is a permanent end to the war and complete reconstruction with Hamas present there. Now, with Trump's plan, saying the end result of this process is the depopulation of Gaza, it makes it very unattractive for Hamas to sign on. So the chances of a resumption of the war are tragically and unfortunately quite high. But at the end of the day, the war will be over. And if these plans are not relevant today, they might be relevant in 3, 4, 5 months.
As negotiations over reconstruction and administration in Gaza proceed, who will ultimately get to decide what plan is executed? At the same time, why don't the Palestinians seem to have much of a say in their own fate?
Unfortunately, the Palestinians don't have much of a say because the Palestinians don't have representation that is, frankly, strong enough and credible enough to decide for them. Hamas might get a say because it has guns, but after October 7th, no one in the international community, including most Arab leaders, look at Hamas as an acceptable address. What Hamas did on October 7th brought along this disaster for the Palestinians, but also brought along major destabilization for the region. So Hamas has written itself out of this. And the Palestinian Authority is frankly too discredited to play this role. So unfortunately, the Palestinians do not have a voice until they get their act together. Ultimately, it will have to be an agreement between the United States, key Arab countries, and Israel, which also has a say. Because at the end of the day, Israel is the one that has security control on the ground. One of the things that I'll be looking at in the Arab League summit that's going to happen in Cairo on March the 4th is who will be tasked with following up. Because the group that will be tasked to follow up will ultimately be the one that's going to be making decisions. If this is a group that is formed from countries that have direct equities in Gaza, and by this I mean Egypt, Jordan, Saudi, UAE, and Qatar, then we're talking serious business. If, on the other hand, other actors come in to be spoilers, then we're in for the same old posturing with very little ability to actually conclude a deal.
The Gulf states will play a very instrumental role in the coming months and likely years. But along with Egypt and Jordan, these are countries that have long-standing relationships with the US, which they continuously seek to strengthen, making this phase of negotiations undoubtedly challenging. Elizabeth Dent is another senior fellow at the Washington Institute, where she focuses on U.S. policy towards the Gulf states. She says there are some promising signs for U.S.-Gulf relations.
Despite what I see as sort of a lack of strategy here from the Trump administration in terms of the proposal to sort of create all of these new real estate developments in Gaza, I actually think that the Gulf states coming up with their own proposal alongside of Egypt and Jordan is a good thing. I mean, it's the region taking responsibility for regional dynamics. And I don't think that it says anything different about the future of the U.S. Gulf relationship. I think it will signal to President Trump that the region is ready and willing to ensure the stability of that area. And I think that it will also signal to President Trump that the Gulf is willing and able to pursue ideas when they are adamantly against one that has been proposed.
The counterproposal also demonstrates to the U.S. that Egypt's plan aligns with a broader vision for security and stability across the region. Elizabeth explains why that is important for the Gulf.
Obviously, the GCC as a collective, as well as each of the regional states on their own, are seeking regional security and stability because it aligns with their economic vision. So this plan of having safe zones and ensuring that the Palestinian population is not displaced and that there is not a massive displacement of persons that would then infringe upon economies of other countries. I think that this aligns quite well with their vision. I think part of the problem will be enforcement mechanisms and monetary funding. I know that the UAE had previously this last summer mentioned that they would be amenable to being part of an initiative on the ground. I think that is probably still on the table. And I think that not just the UAE would, be open to something like that. It's likely that Saudi and others may be willing to do so in the name of providing that very basic security. Obviously, as far as financial donations, I think the Gulf will be on the hook for a lot of that. And I think that they are likely to be supportive of that initiative and ensuring that monetarily the proposal has backing. But I think we are really going to have to see which country Egypt is proposing to take the lead on actually restoring the essential services, implementing the temporary housing, and again, monitoring these quote unquote safe zones.
While the focus is at the moment reconstruction in Gaza, it's almost impossible to ignore the elephant in the room: governance. In fact, both issues go hand in hand, and there's a long way to go before we get a clear picture of how Gaza will be run, at least in a transitional phase. But one other major question is, what role would Arab Gulf states then play?
I think that it means that the Gulf countries are more willing to take or have a hand in the formulation of post-Gaza governance. I don't necessarily think that it means that it will be a boots-on-the-ground involvement in Gaza's governance, but certainly, obviously, with Qatar, for example, there will be pressure on not just Hamas, but also the Palestinians overall to figure out a way to govern this area without having Hamas in charge, which obviously, as we know, is a complete non-starter for the Israeli government. So I do think that there will be some involvement from Gulf states in how this governance will play out. But I think we can't really know. And honestly, the test case is going to be implementation of the first phase of this plan. If the first phase of the plan goes well and the ceasefire continues between Israel and Hamas and the hostages continue to be released and we move into the second phase of the ceasefire plan and begin implementation of the first phase of this Egyptian proposal, then, obviously that would also mean a stronger regional security framework because we're getting into a space where all of the parties have agreed upon an acceptable system of governance and an acceptable path.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. We'll be reporting for you more on this on thenationalnews.com as Arab leaders meet over the next couple of weeks to decide what will happen in Gaza. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.